بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم تسليما كثيرا. So, اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا من فضلك علما وعملا وإخلاصا يا رب العالمين. So we did an introduction to the text and the author last class and mentioned some of the background details. We also began reading the author's introduction, and in reading the author's introduction we looked briefly at some of the meanings of the basmala, of our saying Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. And of course the basmala, three of the statements that are most beloved in Islam are the basmala, the Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, and it's probably the greatest thing you say in any given day, and most of us think less of it than anything else, right? But it's extremely important and extremely powerful. And the second is the hamdallah, praise of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which again we say throughout the day, but we don't give due consideration to it, right? And the third is sending blessings on the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, right? Because what is the consequence of Allah's salah upon the believer? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, "Huwa alladhi yusalli alaykum." He is the one who sends blessings upon you. لِيُخْرِجَكُم مِّنَ الظُّلُمَاتِ إِلَى النُّورِ, to take you out from manifold darknesses to the one light. Right? So that tells us something about the spiritual and transformative power of salah on the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, right? Because the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, "Man salla aliyya wahidatan, sallallahu alayhi ashra." That whoever sends blessings upon me once, said our beloved sallallahu alaihi wasallam, Allah blesses tenfold. And what is the salah of Allah? Right? It's al-ma'na al-mukhrij min al-dhulumati ila-nur. It's that meaning that takes one from, by the Quranic text, from the multiplicity of darkness to the one light. So we looked a little bit at the meanings of each of these, and then his opening sending of blessings, right? Where he pointed towards praising Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for granting, for honoring the best of his servants through the light of the inheritance of the prophets, right? The inheritance. And what is their inheritance? Their inheritance is knowledge. And what knowledge? Beneficial knowledge. What is beneficial knowledge? That which it guides you to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Ilmu ma yuqarribuka ila Allah. Right? But that inheritance, right? That inheritance is something precious to seek, to yearn for, and to strive to embody and convey, because there's nothing better. But then he points to, of course, very importantly, what is the point of the prophetic inheritance? فَأَحْسَنُوا لِذَاتِهِ الْعِبَادَةِ. So they made excellent لِذَاتِهِ, for his sake alone, their submission, right? Their submission, their worship. And we looked at the levels of sincerity there, right? Sincerity. So sincerity, the perfecting of one's worship and submission to Allah, right? That's the personal benefit. And the collective benefit is to guard prophetic guidance. فَحَفِظُوا الشَّرِيعَةَ الشَّرِيعَتَهُ وَبَلَّغُوهَا عِبَادًا, and they conveyed it to others, because that's a prophetic command. بَلِّغُوا عَنِّي وَلَوْ آيَةً, convey from me even if it be one verse. And the concern for conveying but doing so soundly is a critical component of being a concerned believer. To the extent that one has the capacity to do so oneself, then one does so oneself. To the extent that one cannot do so oneself, but to support, to serve, to assist, to pray for that, those are all parts of the duties of conveying. Because conveying entails the tabligh is either the one conveying, right, or the one assisting the one conveying, materially or by their experience, their skills, etc., or financially assisting, but also those serving, right, those facilitating, right, and someone who can't do anything else, praying for that, right, praying for that. And then he bears, it's from the kamal al-ibtida, from the complete beginning is to also say the shahadatain, right? So the ulama said the sunnatul ibtida, right, the sunnah of beginning in religious works is 5 things, and then there are supplements. So the 5 things are, and this is discussed by Imam Zabidi in his introduction to the Ihya, for example. The 5 things are the basmala, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, the hamdallah, hamd on the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, praise of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Thirdly, salah on the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and numerous texts have come regarding each. Then there are 2 that relate to the subject matter, which are what you're talking about and why it's important. Because let's say, some random brother decided to compile a text in Hanafi fiqh called Faridatul Ahkam. And he says, this is a book in the rulings of fiqh. So what? There's so many other books, right? So you mentioned what you're talking about. Why is it important? Why is it important? And this is also the marketing pitch. But marketing for Allah is praiseworthy, because you're not calling to yourself, you're calling to the benefit, right? And that's where you see the ulama will praise their works, as we see from Imam Ash-Shurun Bulali in what we're going to see today. So then we looked at the name of Imam Shurun Bulali and his dua, beginning with dua. So the 5 things that are core to begin with are Basmala, Hamdallah, Salah on the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. Number 2. Number 4, to mention what you're talking about and why. Now there's supplementary things that are yustahsan. Amongst them, to mention who are you? Who are you? That also helps identify the book. To mention who are you? What's the name of the book? Some background on why you wrote it can also be helpful. And so these are some of the supplementary things that are praiseworthy in beginning. To mention who are you? What's the name of the text? Because scribes would get confused. So it's from assisting everyone to mention the name. Right? Why you wrote this? Why you wrote this? Because sometimes that helps. You say, I found that. So Ibn Abdin in his Hashia on the Durr al-Mukhtar, he says, وَقَدْ عُلِّقَتْ عَلَيْهِ حَوَاشِي جُلُّهَا غَوَاشِي. Many Hashiyas were written on it. Most of them aren't the real thing. They fall far short. Right? Most of them fall far short. So others mention other points of benefit. Right? They mention other points of benefit related to a text. Right? such as, but that background helps. Another of the things that are praiseworthy to mention is to mention any particular terminology that one has or usages that one has. Right? So for example, if you look in the Jami' al-Saghir, which is a precious book, a lot of modern people ignore it to their own folly, right? Which is, he collected 10,000 spoken hadiths of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Now, there, the Imam Suyuti uses abbreviations for the books that he's referencing, the books of hadith. So it's 10,000 spoken hadiths of the Prophet ﷺ. So it's not the hadith of description or of the actions of the Prophet ﷺ, etc. 10,000 spoken hadiths, arranged alphabetically. It's very useful for that, because on any subject you'll find related hadith close together, and also similarly worded hadith where it's talking about other things. So the most beloved of actions to Allah, whole range of hadith, ahabbul a'mali ilallah. And you see ahab, see the other things that are beloved to Allah. So it's very useful for many reasons. But he mentions in the opening his terminology, right? That when he so because for abbreviation he did not mention the full name of the books. So he mentions, he has a whole list of abbreviations. So he mentioned that in the beginning. If you have particular usages, so from your usages, whether it be abbreviations, Imam Ibrahim al-Halabi in the opening of Multaqa al-Abhur explains that when he mentions two opinions, the Hanafi books differ. Some mention the stronger opinion second. Some mention the stronger opinion first. Some say, I'm not commenting on which one is stronger unless I make an explicit statement. Some, like the Hidayah, he, out of adab with the Imams of our madhab, he generally chooses the stronger opinion most of the time based on ta'khir al-dalil. He mentions the reasoning for the stronger opinions last. So that's like, right? But he, so that's good. But don't confuse us with what you're doing. Mention your method in the beginning if there's particular methodical points, and we'll see there's some methodical points here. Also, it can help to, it from the supplementary things is to mention extra dhikr, particularly shahadatain, and right, to mention extra dhikr. And the precedent for that, for example, is the khutab of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, because writing is a form of expression just as speech is. So it's just a background point of benefit, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. So Imam Shurumulali, after his opening supplication, he says, rahimahullahu ta'ala, inna hadha kitabun saghirun hajmuh. He says, rahimahullahu ta'ala, truly this is a book small in size. Ghazirun ilmuhu, deep in its knowledge, right? Or vast in his knowledge, right? 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 Plentiful in its knowledge, right? So deep in its knowledge. Sahihun hukmuhu, sound in its rulings, right? So he mentions, and why is he doing this? It is not self-praise, but this is highlighting the benefit of what he is conveying. So this is of the praise that is so inna hadha al-kitab saghirun hajmuh. Now, this book is small in size. This is in a relative sense, right? In a relative sense. right? Small in size relative to Omar. Relative to other books that would have a similar number of rulings. Right? And that's why you have to pay attention to what he's saying. He's not saying this is a small book. Right? This is a book that is small yet deep in its, but deep in its knowledge. So this amount of knowledge is not gathered typically in this comparatively small size. Why? Because most books that go into this amount of details, what do they have? They mention the discussions around the issues. Right? They mention the discussions around the issues. Whereas in Nur al-Idah and in the Matan and in the Sharh as well, Maraqi al-Falah, he gathered a lot in one place. The Matan itself does not have the discussions that the larger works have. And this is where paying attention is important for the Talib Ilm. The opening of Nur al-Idah itself, what does it say? Yeah, he mentions in it that هذا مختصر. What did he say? جمعت فيه ما تشتت من مسائل المطولات, or something like that. So this is a summary work in which I gathered that which was scattered of the issues mentioned in the large works of the madhab. What does he actually say? Right? مقدمة تقرب للمبتدئ ما تشتت من مسائل المطولات. That which was scattered in the larger books. So it's not a small book. This is a trick question. Someone was paying attention if we asked real questions. Said, is Nur al-Idah a small text in the fiqh of worship? No. It's one of the most detailed texts in the fiqh of worship. A few years ago I was teaching a class in which we were covering the Tanwir al-Absar of Imam al-Tumurtashi with the Durr al-Mukhtar of Imam al-Haskafi, and referring throughout to Hashit ibn Abdin. Sometimes we'd read a discussion in Hashit ibn Abdin and say, if you want more details, look in the Matan of Nur al-Idah. Because the Matan of Nur al-Idah would mention more issues in the Matan than Ibn Abdin mentions in his Hashiyah on the issue. Because he gathered. So this is meant to be an encompassing Matan. هذا كتاب صغير حجمه هذا كتاب غزير علمه. It's deep in its knowledge. But this is not meant for beginners. Nur al-Idah is not meant for beginners, nor is the Maraqi. إن هذا الدين متين فأوغلوا فيه برفق. The Prophet ﷺ said this religion is deep, so enter its depths gently, meaning gradually. Right? برفق here, gently meaning gradually. Otherwise, you could drown. So similarly for the student of knowledge. صحيح حكمه. Its rulings are sound. Right? Here in Imdad al-Fattah, in his larger commentary, right, from which he summarized Maraqi al-Falah, he points to the fact that its rulings are sound even when most of the scholars may have deemed another opinion asah. Right? Because, and it's clear from that and from his usage throughout that Imam Shurunbulali held himself to have the capacity for tarjih within the opinions of the school. So sometimes, but he mentions himself, right, that in the larger commentary, that the rulings are sound, even if other rulings may have, another opinion may have been deemed more correct. And we'll be touching upon some of those, because sometimes the ulama held one position, but Imam Shurunbulali may prefer an opinion because it is more cautious. Sometimes he may prefer an opinion because it's easier in a place where there's difficulty. In another place he may prefer an opinion because he feels the evidence is stronger, but reluctantly, as we'll see. But he has that drive, or he is in agreement, whether complete or cautious, with Al-Kamal ibn al-Humam, for example, and some of his unique choices within the madhab. So that is a sound opinion. Now, where do sound opinions come from in the Hanafi school? Right? The Hanafi school has come to us through works that are called the books of Zahirul Riwayah. Right? And these are the main works transmitted by Imam Muhammad ibn al-Hasan. Right? So, Imam Abu Hanifa's two main students were Abu Yusuf and Muhammad ibn al-Hasan. And then lower than them in rank, but at a level of ijtihad, was also Imam Zufar and Hasan ibn Ziyad al-Lu'lu'i. These are the four giants around Imam Abu Hanifa. Right? But most of the time, two principal opinions survive. Sometimes also the opinion of Zufar, frequently, and occasionally on Al-Hasan ibn Ziyad. Sometimes we have a secondary narration from Imam Abu Hanifa from Hasan, and we'll see some of the narrations of Al-Hasan, such as on the issue of Raf' min al-Ruku', the secondary opinion that it's wajib is Al-Hasan ibn Ziyad's narration from Imam Abu Hanifa. So if you say Al-Hasan in Hanafi fiqh, it refers to, and who is Al-Hasan? Right? In general, in the Islamic tradition, Al-Hasan refers to Al-Hasan ibn Al-Hasan al-Basri, because Sayyidina Al-Hasan ibn Ali radiyallahu ta'ala anhuma, the body of quotes from him and sayings and so on is relatively small. So in general, it's referring to Al-Hasan al-Basri, like in the books of hadith, etc., especially in the books of spirituality, of zuhud, a lot is quoted from him, Al-Hasan. But when you say Al-Hasan, specifically in the context of the prophetic household, and sometimes contextually it'll be Al-Hasan ibn Ali, radiallahu ta'ala anhu, Imam Hasan. But in a Hanafi fiqh book, if it says Al-Hasan, it refers to, almost inevitably, Al-Hasan ibn Ziyad al-Lu'lu'i. Right? So these books of Zahir al-Riwayah were transmitted by Imam Muhammad ibn al-Hasan, because Abu Yusuf authored a range of books himself, but they were more topical and he taught them less. Imam Abu Yusuf became the Chief Justice, the first Qadi to be referred to as Qadi al-Qudat, the Chief Justice, under Harun al-Rashid. And just as a point of benefit, the Orientalists have said all kinds of wacky things about Harun al-Rashid, sometimes basing historical events on books of literature, which is a bit, that's like interpreting Ottoman history from the TV series, right? Which is not a source of historical evidence. You go to khutbah and quote Ibn Arabi. Why? Because I heard it on Ertugrul. Right? Doesn't work. Right? So there's a beautiful work by Shaykh al-Buti called Shakhsiyat Istawqafatni, personalities that made me pay attention, and he talks about Harun al-Rashid there and clarifies some of the Orientalist confusions. In the modern age, one of the sad things that happened was because the Orientalists were trying to study us deeply so that they could colonize, so the West could colonize the Muslim world. Some of their studies were quite interesting. So people who were confused, you had in Cairo, especially in Damascus, you had Muslims who were confused. Like, wow, because suddenly there's all this funding from the European colonial powers, they're producing all this literature. Why? Because a lot of funding. So they were translating Orientalist literature about Islamic history into Arabic. And so you have the idea of al-Asr al-Dhahabi, the golden age. Guess who talked about the golden age? It was the Orientalists. But many of the modernists and reformists, right? Both the liberal reformists and the conservative reformists, because they both have the same fundamental tendencies, took many of these ideas from them. But anyways, so Zahir al-Riwayah, so Abu Yusuf was busy as a qadi. Of course he taught and transmitted and so on, but Imam Muhammad al-Hasan spent much of his scholarly life teaching and writing. Right? So even much of what we know about Abu Yusuf's opinions is transmitted through Muhammad ibn al-Hasan. Now we won't go at length. Inshallah, we'll do some separate programs on the history of the Hanafi school. But just be aware of one point, which is the reason. Though we have the books of Zahir al-Riwayah, historically, none of the major commentaries in the madhab are on the books of Zahir al-Riwayah, even though we have all of them to this date. Why? Because scholarship is a process. Right? Scholarship is a process. So Imam Abu Hanifa established this interpretive school, formalizing what he received from his teachers, from the madrasa, so to speak, of Ibrahim al-Nakhai. Right? The most notable of those after Ibrahim Nakhai that he took from was Hamad ibn Abi Sulaiman. They had a definitive method which was formalized by Imam Abu Hanifa, and he had a clear teaching method and a clear transmitting method on how he systematically dealt with matters of fiqh. Right? So, but Imam Muhammad al-Hasan gathered those issues and derived further matters, right? But how do you apply those issues? How do you arrange those issues, right? And who were the books of Zahir al-Riwayah talking to? And the books of Zahir al-Riwayah were addressing Imam Abu Hanifa's gathering. By all standards, both Abu Yusuf and Muhammad al-Hasan are both mujtahid imams. That they are both independent mujtahids. They're mujtahid mutlaq, muntasib, but who ascribe themselves to Imam Abu Hanifa. But according to the scholars of Hanafi usul and usul al-fatwa, the general position is that they were absolute mujtahids, but whose method corresponded to their method of their teacher on most things. But they differed with Abu Hanifa even in some of their method, as becomes clear in Hanafi usul. Imam Zufar was clearly at a certain level of ijtihad, maybe not an absolute mujtahid, but up there. Hassan ibn Ziyad as well, and others. And the people taking from Muhammad al-Hasan were at that level. Right? So now, later people come, the works of Zahir al-Riwayah are not arranged as rigorously as the later works are. Number one. Number two, they are full of subtlety. They are full of subtlety because they're addressing people at a level that a lot is being assumed of what they understand of context and consideration and method of legal interpretation, etc. So it's not just a simple matter, okay, you want to know what is Zahir al-Riwayah? Just go open the books of Zahir al-Riwayah and see what Muhammad al-Hasan says. Because it's not so simple. Because meanings are understood not just by the expression of the text, but also by the maratib al-dilalat, by the levels of indication. And also, what exactly does he mean by that? The usage of the earlier scholars was often quite expansive. They said things like, uhib, la uhib. I like and I don't like. What, in this context, what does that mean? What is his usage in it? Which is why, despite all the opinions of Imam Abu Yusuf, Abu Hanifa and Abu Yusuf and Imam Muhammad, all being transmitted to us in Zahir Riwayah and in the secondary works, yet still the ulama gathered mukhtasarat, mutun. Right? So in the early stages we had works like the Mukhtasar of al-Karhi, and the Mukhtasar of al-Tahawi, and some of these earlier mutun. Then we have the mutun that the madhab rested upon. These mutun were required. Matns like Quduri, which we're doing on Monday nights, were required. Why? Because Zahir al-Riwayah is not so straightforward to figure out. Necessarily. Sometimes it's clear. Sometimes the ulama that came after that, there is a marhalat al-takhrij of derivation. That what exactly is understood from this ruling? Or what principle is this based on? And there's a whole body of the early Hanafi ulama who are ulama al-takhrij. And then you see that the ulama try to figure, often rulings are mentioned in Zahir Riwayah, but what's the underlying principle? And that's very important because it is based on the principle that you can derive other rulings. So when we come to the section on prayer, we will see that there's 12 issues called al-Masailul Ithnay Ashariya, where if something happens after the final sitting, it breaks the prayer. That's the ruling. But why does it break the prayer? Al-Karhi and Al-Burda'i differed on the takhrij of the issue. Now what is the basis for this breaking the prayer? So it's transmitted from Abu Hanifa that it breaks the prayer. Why does it break the prayer? They try to deduce, based on his other principles and his method, why would it break the prayer here? Because only when you know the basis could you then derive other rulings from it. Sometimes the ulama would ascribe things to Zahir Riwayah because this is understood not from the text of Zahir Riwayah, but from its ta'leel, because of its underlying reasoning. Or by its dilala, this is mafhum min Zahir Riwayah. Right? Or min lawazim, what is entailed by it. Right? So it's not child's play. Like if everything that we needed was, we could just dig up ourselves on Zahir Riwayah, then you don't need the Hanafi madhab. The Hanafi scholarship say just go back. But we have what we can call the madhabi Salafism, or the Salafi madhabism, which is people who follow a madhab, but they say, look, we now have Kitab al-Umm. Why let's see what Imam Shafi'i himself said. Ya Rajul. If you go to Shafi'i Faqih and say, what does Imam Shafi'i say about this? That's a big thing to ask. Not that it's closed door, but there's conditions to be able to get there, right? And the books of the madhab are peer-reviewed, intergenerational attempts at defining, just plug it out and plug it back in. At defining what is the position of Abu Hanifa, what is meant by this. So the core of the madhab is Zahir al-Riwayah, but it is not simply a matter of going back to those books. The ulama, in order to clarify what is Zahir al-Riwayah, they put together these mutun. And they say, وُضِعَتِ الْمُتُونَ لِنَقْلِ ظَاهِرِ الرِّوَايَةِ. The mutun were put together to transmit to us what is the Zahir al-Riwayah, what is the transmission of the madhab, and what is the position of the Imam. But even you see in something as late as Quduri, into the fourth Islamic, he lived in the 4th Islamic century, died in what year? Yeah, died in 428, 430. In the first part of the 5th century. Even then, there are issues in Quduri that are the scholars who came after said, no, that's not the main Zahir, that's not Zahir al-Riwayah. Not because Quduri didn't know Zahir al-Riwayah, but because it's not such a straightforward thing. It's not such a straightforward thing. And that's the nature of knowledge, right? So the mutun were placed to explain the madhab. The source of sound rulings is what is the established position of Abu Hanifa and his students. And the asl is that what's in the mutun is given precedence insofar as that is the core transmission of the madhab. Then there are fundamental commentaries in the madhab that explain the mutun and explain the rulings that are derived from the mutun. Right? And if there's an opinion in a commentary, on its own, what's in the matan is given precedence. Right? Because what's in the commentary is the judgment of the author. Zahir riwayah is given precedence. Unless the author is verifying what is the sound position in the madhab. And that goes into what is called usul al-fatwa, the principles of fatwa. Right? Because there are reasons why the position of Abu Hanifa might be left. Sometimes the scholar may choose other than Zahir al-Riwayah, other than what's in the matan, because Zahir al-Riwayah is something else. Or he may choose it based on need or circumstance or caution or hardship, right? Or because of custom, right? So there are, a whole number of criteria by which a ruling may be left. On some occasions, even due to strength of evidence, if the scholar is at the level of ijtihad within the madhab, like the scholars generally concurred Kamal ibn al-Humam was. And those are principles. We'll talk about how the Hanafi school works at a separate time, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. So Zahir riwayah is a root of the madhab, but that was then explained in these core mutun of the school. These mutun required explaining to clarify them, tawdih, to specify the rulings. It's called taqyid, right? To specify details that clarify, that part of the clarificatory process. Tawdih, taqyid, but also critically, especially in the Hanafi school, at-ta'lil. So there's tawdih, taqyid, ta'lil, identifying what is the underlying legal reason, right? Right? Like, why is the ruling the way it is? Right? And this is critical, especially in the Hanafi madhab. You don't understand the madhab unless you know the reasoning, the ta'lil. But there's also the tadlil, which is to give the evidentiary basis for the ruling from the primary evidentiary sources, Quran, Sunnah, Ijma', Qiyas, etc. And the tadlil, what is the evidentiary basis of this? Then there's tafsil or tafriya, right? Which is the rulings that are derivative from this. Okay? And we listed some of these 7-8 different types of explanation, like of the roles of commentary. But then, and this is a great, like the great project of scholarship, right? Of checks and balances, and then new things kept coming up. New things kept coming up. You can wipe over a khuf, but then some lands they had very thin khufs. Some lands they had khufs that went below the ankle. There's khufs that the way they're tied left little gaps. So what do you do with those? So once they settle on an explanation, they'd add the explanatory conditions to the issue, right? As part of this process. But then the rulings, the books become wide and scattered. So okay, let's gather that and summarize, right? So in this process of verification and back and forth, there was so after the age of the 4 mutun, right? So we had 4 mutun that emerged, right? And we've talked about the 4 mutun before, right? Quduri, Mukhtar, Kenz, and the Wiqaya. But along with that, some great commentaries emerged in the Hanafi school, right? Some separate commentaries, and some explaining these 4 mutun that are the key teaching texts. And we'll go into that. This making more, we need to have a full series of classes on how the Hanafi school works, bi-idhnillahi ta'ala, which we'll cover systematically. But there was fundamentally from the 6th Islamic century onwards, right? There's these great commentaries in the madhab. Great commentaries such as the Mabsut of Imam al-Sarakhsi, which he wrote a lot of it in a pot well. He was imprisoned in a pot well in Central Asia for speaking out against the ruler. And he dictated much of it from a room in the pot well. And at the end of each volume, he'd complain about his, the condition. And then when he came out, but the book was the same before and after, right? And he transmitted the whole madhab, not only Abu Hanifa's position, but the 2 companions and a Shafi'i, and the reasoning of each, and the back and forth, and the reasoning of each, and which is stronger, and the details, and the rulings, and this and that, right? And that's ilm. That's what it's called, Shamsul A'imma, al-Sarakhsi. And Al-Kasani's Bada'i' al-Sana'i'. Al-Kasani's teacher, Ala ad-Din al-Samarqandi, wrote a work called Tuhfatul Fuqaha, a gift for jurists, which he took Quduri and combined it with some issues from some other books, but rearranged it in a very clear way. It's a beautiful work. Tuhfatul Fuqaha. His most diligent students were 2. Ala ad-Din Samarqandi, his daughter Fatima, and Al-Kasani. So Al-Kasani wrote a commentary on his teacher's book and married his daughter. Right? So they say, شرح تحفته وتزوج ابنته. He commented on his tuhfa and married his daughter. Right? And when the father, Samarqandi, used to give fatwa, there used to frequently be a second handwriting with them. And in his classes, she used to sit behind the curtain and often give feedback. After he retired and passed away, Samarqandi, his student Al-Kasani took his place as the teacher, and the fatwas that would come would still have 2 handwritings. The handwriting of Kasani and the old handwriting that used to be there, which was not Samarqandi's because he passed away. It was Fatima Samarqandiya, his daughter. And they say they were buried next to each other and 2 trees grew and they intertwined. I don't know about that part. But and Bada'i' al-Sana'i' is an amazing work in the Hanafi school. Then this is into the 6th century. In the 6th century as well, you had the Hidayah of al-Marghinani. He took Quduri, but he found a lot of very useful issues in the Jami' al-Saghir, which is one of the most important of the books of Zahir Riwayah by Muhammad al-Hasan. He added the 2 together into a composite matan called the Bidayah, which is just Quduri with some of the issues of the Jami' al-Saghir, which sometimes aren't really practical issues, but they're illustrative issues. They lay out very important derivative principles. Anyways, and sometimes they're just outright, just directly important. Anyways, and he wrote the masterpiece of the Hanafi madhab, the Hidayah. It took him 11 years to write this 1,000-page book. He fasted consistently through that time, secretly. So daily his family would send him the food, and he'd sworn his servant to secrecy. The servant would come in with the food and leave from the door from his library, his study room, and give the food as charity to the poor, but far enough from the home that the word wouldn't spread, right? And he sustained that throughout till they found out indirectly. And the Hidayah, which is built upon Quduri, of course, and Jami' al-Saghir, but it brought together and clarified above all, the marvel of the Hidayah is the precision of its legal reasoning. Everyone who came after is dependent upon al-Marghilani for that brilliance of legal reasoning. And of course it's great in many, many different ways. And of course, many other important works were authored in that time. Qadi Khan emerged in the 6th Islamic century as well. And numerous works of fatwa were written, right, on the derivative issues. But they became scattered and the opinions kind of spread, became vast. Qadi Khan, he compiled this authoritative book of fatwa, so authoritative that they say, لا يفتى بخلاف ما في قاضي خان. Or لا يفتى بخلاف قاضي خان. Fatwa is not given contrary to Qadi Khan. Because he is, because of his rank in the madhab, he was so senior, but also because of his precision and diligence. Radiallahu ta'ala anhum ajma'in. And then, once the Hidayah was written, countless works were written on the Hidayah. From, starting from the 7th century to the 9th century particularly. Countless works were written on the Hidayah. Imam al-Nasafi, Imam Hafizuddin al-Nasafi, who authored Kanz al-Daqa'iq, had originally wanted to write a book commenting upon the Hidayah. But he had a dream and inspiration that write a book like the Hidayah and commented upon it. And that was the Wafi and the Kafi. And he wrote a number of other very important works in the Hanafi school as well. Al-Mustasfa, in al-Furu', not the Mustasfa from al-Ghazali. But then he said, given what he'd compiled, he said, we need to distill this down into something really precise. And given all that's been done now, post-Quduri, right? Because the Mukhtar came in the 6th century as well, the Hidayah came, all these works came. There was a consolidation of the fatwa, because the opinions had begun to scatter. A number of great scholars sort of brought the madhab back to its core, right? So he wrote a matan called Kanz al-Daqa'iq, the treasure chest of subtleties, right? It's, of the 4 mutun, it's arguably the greatest. And then that became the reference really for the commentaries afterwards, right? So it became the habit that Quduri would be studied to introduce people to the school, because it's clear, the language is clear and so on. But then the real, break your knees would be with the Kanz and its commentaries. And many commentaries were written on Kanz al-Daqa'iq. Imam al-Zayla'i came and wrote a commentary called Tabyin al-Haqa'iq, right, which is where he built upon the legal reasoning mentioned in the Hidayah, and it's a really great work, Tabyin al-Haqa'iq, but its focus is on the istidlal. It's a sharh istidlali, on the legal reasoning part. And the istidlal, or the ta'lil, right? Istidlal for the legal reasoning. But it's a magnificent work. Has the merits of a lot of clarity as well. And then of course, in the 9th century, Al-Kamal ibn al-Humam wrote what is arguably the definitive commentary on the Hidayah. Other great we can't go into the whole history of it's one of the most commented upon books in human history. Al-Kamal ibn al-Humam wrote his work Fath al-Qadir, right, which is the greatest commentary on the greatest commentary in fiqh, right? I didn't mention the Hanafi madhab in fiqh, right? And Al-Kamal ibn al-Humam shook up the madhab, right? He really shook up the madhab in method and because a lot had happened, right? It's now late into the 9th Islamic century, Right? A lot of challenges were arising, a lot of issues, and you needed to have a definitive addressing of those issues. So on many issues, Al-Kamal al-Humam took a stance. Right? Unpacked issues where he doesn't follow the Zahir al-Riwayah. But he doesn't just do it out of just academic curiosity. Ultimately, fiqh is based on ahkam amaliyya. Al-ahkam المتعلقة بأفعال المكلفين. The rulings related to the actions of those morally responsible. And the actions of morally responsible are affected by who they are and what are their circumstances and what is affecting them. So these are purposeful. That method, and we see a lot of it reflected in Imam Shurunbulali from the time of Al-Kamal ibn al-Humam. Those people who came after were deeply affected by him. Right? Amongst them are some of his students who are giants, like Allama Qasim ibn Qutlubugha al-Sudani, Ibn Amir Hajj, and others. And then Ibn Nujaym. Ibn Nujaym came late 10th century, and he wrote an expansive commentary on Kanz al-Daqa'iq, deeply influenced by Al-Kamal ibn al-Humam, but also by all these other works written on the Hidayah, but also all the other works written on the Kanz itself, particularly Tabyin al-Haqa'iq. But Tabyin al-Haqa'iq focused on the legal reasoning. Ibn Nujaym's focus was fatwa, to really consolidate the madhab. Right? And he consulted a vast array of books, which he mentions in the opening of his Bahr. And then that became, really for a period of time, the source of fatwa in the madhab. Right? The large work that is consulted was Al-Bahr al-Ra'iq. And works were written upon it by others. But Al-Bahr al-Ra'iq was given this place of preeminence. Now the reason we're getting is like where are the influences of Ash-Shurunbulali in identifying the relied upon position in the madhab? Right? In identifying the relied upon position in the madhab. Right? So these are some of the works, and you see this. I'm trying to trace a broad stroke of influence. Right? So when he's saying its opinions are sound, what's going on?
The charger isn't working.
Do you have a iPhone charger? Okay. So you have Ibn Nujaym, right, up here. Ibn Nujaym's younger brother wrote an influential work as well called An-Nahr al-Fa'iq. He was a student of his older brother. So you have An-Najm ibn Nujaym. His younger brother wrote a book called An-Nahr al-Fa'iq. But another student of who took from Ibn Nujaym, was brilliant in his own regard, and deep scholarship, is referred to as Shaykh al-Islam. And actually he was Palestinian. Okay. Shaykh al-Islam at-Tumurtashi al-Ghazi. And sometimes he'll be referred to as al-Ghazi. He looked at all this expanse, right? So you now have the key matan that is being focused upon is Kanz al-Daqa'iq. Kanz al-Daqa'iq really took what was in the other mutun before it, but it stretched it out, right? Added to them. So now you have all this other scholarship that has come up. The purpose of mutun is naqlul madhab, is to transmit the core of the school. So someone who studies it, understands it, will know the rulings that people need. That's the purpose of a matan. The commentaries then clarify, explain, and so on, right? But for the purpose of retaining the core of the issues. So all this scholarship has come through. Now, so there needs to be almost like an upgrade to the tanweer. Sorry, the upgrade to the kanz. In the 9th century, before Tumurtashi did what he did, another very impressive work was authored by a very impressive Ottoman called Ad-Durar, which is a commentary on the Ghurar, by Mullah Khusro, who used to be Qadi al-Askar, the chief, the Qadi of the Ottoman military. And the Ottomans fought a lot of wars and defended Islam, and the Qadi al-Askar was a very senior position. He didn't want to have it. If you look at the opening of the Durar, you see his lament at his wasted years and so on. But he wrote a matan called the Ghurar, but it wasn't sought in itself. He added unique, like he really consolidated a lot in the matan. But the commentary was brilliant. The Durar added loads of, it was a marvel of gems from what the scholars before mentioned, but also from his brilliance. He was also a great usuli. So he really did some marvelous work in that. So Tumurtashi, taking number one, the Kanz, the works on the Kanz of Imam Nasafi, the works on the Kanz, the commentaries on the Hidayah, right, that have preceded, and this marvel that is the Durar, and then his teacher's work, Al-Bahr al-Ra'iq, which really, and many other influences, but these, he put together a matan that is really built upon Tanweer al-Absar, that is built on Kanz al-Daqa'iq. It's a matan, which is called Tanweer al-Absar. But it was a matan. He wrote a commentary on it, and that commentary would have had great influence. Called Minahul Ghaffar. But within a few decades, now into the 11th Islamic century, Imam Alauddin al-Haskafi of Damascus, he's originally from northern Syria, he wrote Ad-Durrul Mukhtar, the chosen pearl. Right? Now, that is, but Imam Shurun Bulali comes there pre-Durrul Mukhtar. They're contemporaries by time, right? Imam Shurun Bulali and al-Haskafi they overlapped. But Imam Shurun Bulali wrote a hashia on the Durar of Mullah Khusro. So he was deeply influenced by Mullah Khusro. He was deeply influenced by Ibn al-Humam's Fath al-Qadir and the students of Ibn al-Humam, both Allama Qasim and particularly Ibn Amir Hajj. He is deeply influenced also by Ibrahim al-Halabi, who we skipped mention of. But Ibrahim al-Halabi is important with respect to Imam Shurun Bulali, because Ibrahim al-Halabi died midway through the 10th century, 950 something. Ibrahim al-Halabi, who had migrated from Halab to Istanbul, to Constantinople. And he was requested there that people are getting confused about the madhab. And what's in Quduri is not sufficient. But the Kanz is too technical. Like Kanz is very subtle, especially in some of the remote areas. The people's Arabic is not strong enough to really get what's in the Kanz. So, but your The fuqaha need clear texts, but that are comprehensive. So he wrote a book called Multaqa al-Abhur, the meeting place of the oceans, where he gathered all four mutun of the madhab into a mata-matan. This preceded the tanweer, right? He gathered the four mutun, Quduri, Mukhtar, Kanz, and the Wiqaya, and he added important masail from the Hidayah and the Majma' and a few other books as well, with clear expressions and clearly identifying where needed what's the relied upon position. And this became a source of great influence in the Ottoman lands, etc. But Shurunbulali clearly was influenced by that work of Imam Ibrahim al-Halabi. But he was also deeply influenced by two commentaries of Ibrahim al-Halabi on one book. A Central Asian scholar wrote a work called Munyatul Musalli, the aims of the worship of the worshipper. And this is a very useful method. In some ways, it's more useful than Nur al-Idah insofar as that it's briefer, so it's easier to teach, but it's less precise. But it's well arranged and so on. So a number of people wrote commentaries on it. But this Bunyat al-Musalli is very influential in Nur al-Idah, very clearly, particularly through the influence of Ibrahim al-Halabi, who wrote a large commentary on it that gathered a lot of legal details around the issues and the legal reasoning and a lot of verification of what's the relied upon position based on the late Hanafi school. And he was deeply influenced by the method of al-Kamal ibn al-Humam. But then people said, this is too much. Halabi al-Kabir is like a brick, like slightly big. So they wanted something in there, so he abridged it, and it's become famous now as Halabi al-Saghir. So they're two kind of like what happened with Imam Shurunbulali with his two commentaries on his own text. So he's clearly influenced by these two works. Al-Kamal ibn al-Humam's own direct student, Ibn Amir Hajj, also wrote a commentary on Munyat al-Musalli as well. So you see a lot of influences gathering upon Imam Shurunbulali. Right? So Imam Shurunbulali came with this great, so he's not just speaking in the fact that this man came and gathered all this stuff. There's this real rich body of scholarship. And of course, and there's a lot of other things. This is an abstracted simplification. So he gathered this method, right? And Sahih al-Hukmuhu, and these scholars are called the ulama, and the scholars who check the opinions, and okay, these are called ulama al-tarjih, of preference, and there's levels of preference depending on how central the issue is, right? So this is now. So Imam Shurunbulali was the senior most Hanafi of his age, and he was a marji' for fatwa and for teaching the madhab in Cairo at the time. People used to travel to study with him. His hashia on the Durar used to be taught at Al-Azhar, was taught in Istanbul, was taught across, was taught in Iraq, was clearly taught in Damascus, because in the generation after him, the Mufti of Damascus has a hashia on the same work, and he references Shurunbulali. So it's a very influential book, and everyone after quotes it. That's a hashia on the Durra. But work continued after Shurunbulali, because his contemporary Ala ad-Din al-Haskafi of Damascus wrote Ad-Durr al-Mukhtar, and he made legal choices. And the Durr al-Mukhtar, and we'll close our digression of the madhab on this, the Durr al-Mukhtar really became the go-to for fatwa in the madhab. And he's pointing to several things in the choice of the title, because the Ottomans really paid attention to Durar and what was written on it, but many pearls. So he said, this is the chosen pearl. Right? And in his introduction, he points to the fact that while the Bahr al-Ra'iq may be an ocean, but he says in his introduction, he says, فَمَنْ أَتْقَنَ كِتَابِ هَذَا فَهُوَ الْفَقِيهُ الْمَاهِرُ. Whoever masters this book of mine, said al-Haskafi, فَهُوَ الْفَقِيهُ الْمَاهِرُ. He is the adept jurist. لِأَنَّهُ هُوَ الْبَحْرُ. Because this truly is the ocean, لكن بلا ساحل, but without shores. It's a sea without shore. Right? And he described why. Like he was like a love poem to his own poem, right? And then that became everyone was revolving around the Durr al-Mukhtar, and they continue to this day for fatwa. And much of what was written on it, they weren't at the level of al-Haskafi, and they missed. He was very conservative in his usage of words. A lot of it was hidden. Imam al-Tahtawi wrote in the same, just one generation before, but contemporary to Ibn Abdin, wrote his hashiyah on al-Durr al-Mukhtar. Imam Ahmad al-Tahtawi. And that did a great service to the Durr, but still did not quite do it justice. And then came the scholar, rightfully referred to as Khatimatul Muhaqqiqeen, the seal of the scholars of verification of the Hanafi school, Sayyidi Muhammad ibn Abidin, and he wrote his Raddul Muhtar, returning the bewildered, on the Durr al-Mukhtar. And that is the key work for fatwa. There are many works afterwards that also tackle so not everything there's nobody who's unconditionally followed in our religion except the messengers. Not Imam Abu Hanifa, not any of his companions. There's no book in the madhab that every ruling in it is agreed upon as being relied upon. That's not the nature of knowledge. Sometimes the same scholar will differ with himself in the same book. You see that in the Maraqi as well, if you're paying attention. Because that's just the nature of knowledge. So that's just to give a little bit of, but if someone were to simplify, you want to know what's the relied upon position, the ulama said the default. 99 times out of 100, or over 90-something% of the time, what Ibn Abdin says is the final word. Why? Because he came after all the other people. And he was very systematic in his method. And not necessarily. Even his own son, Ala ad-Din Abidin, in the Hadiyah, has a good range of issues. I can remember at least 5, 6 at least. There's probably more than that if one paid proper attention, where he disagrees with his father in the matters of worship. He disagrees with his father a lot more in other works. Because fiqh is a matter of judgment. And the more detail you go into, the more nuanced the judgment becomes. Because multiple considerations enter into the same issue. So, it's only a simpleton who doesn't realize that there's nuance to the issue, and more than one interpretive possibility clearly arises, even within one school. That's Sahih al-Hukm, right? He says, احتوى على ما به تصحيح العبادات. It contains that which is a means for correcting one's acts of worship, right? Of making sound one's acts of worship. Al-Khams, the 5. Which is an important... now here, this is introduction to the commentary, right? Al-Ibadat al-Khams is pointing to something that if you've studied Nur al-Idah, he's mentioning by indication that he's adding 2 chapters to the book. Why? Because Nur al-Idah has purification, prayer, and fasting. It does not have the rulings of zakat or hajj. But here he's pointing to the fact that he's added those. And so this corrects at 2 levels. Tasheeh, right? تصحيح one بحيث تجزئ such that one is valid and تصحيح بأن تكون موافقة للسنة and so that they correspond to the sunnah. Okay? There's higher level of correcting. It says بعبارة منيرة with a radiant expression. With a radiant expression. So its meaning is very clear. كالبدر والشمس, like the moon and the sun. Right? And this is irtiqa, right? Taraqi. It's like the moon, even more so, it's like the sun. Okay? But the moon has merits and the sun doesn't, and vice versa. دليله من الكتاب العزيز والسنة الشريفة. Right? He also mentioned it's got clear expressions, and he mentions the evidentiary basis. Why? Now, the evidentiary basis, this gives us a greater resolve to act and a greater understanding of the basis of what we're following. Because as Ibn Abdin makes clear in his work on Usul al-Fatwa, weighing evidence, right? Weighing evidence is only the province of a mujtahid. Right? So the absolute mujtahid is one who has their own principles by which they derive rulings from the Quran and the Sunnah. Right? So it's like, the Quran and Sunnah, if they're, you have, say, okay, I know how to derive steaks from this meat. What do you use to derive it? You need tools. Even if it's your hands, what do you use? I don't use anything. I just take it straight. That's not a steak, right? Similarly, it's not possible. So I want a nas from the Quran. I want a nas from the Hadith. Okay, but the Hadith says A, what do you derive from it? That's what you need a madhab for, right? So you have an absolute mujtahid and someone who has their own principles of derivation. And this was rarely accepted from anyone in Islamic history. Right? The people who are generally acknowledged to be the absolute mujtahids were pretty much all in that age of ijtihad because there's a need for it and they're close enough to revelation to have because there's tangible requirements, but there's also the intangibles. And then they're still in the age of where the reverberation of revelation and its meanings were clear. So, absolute mujtahid. Then you have a mujtahid, and there are levels of mujtahid within the madhab. So they are following the principles of an imam, but they're able to apply those principles directly to the primary texts. And the ulama mentioned tabaqat al-fuqaha. Are they 7 or 8 or 4? Those are matters of nomenclature. Then you have very learned scholars who do not do ijtihad, but they are able to apply the derived rulings of the madhab to particular situations and have multiple roles. And this is not ijtihad, this is called takhrij. Right? They derive rulings based on what has already been derived from the primary sources. And that's the role of the ulama of a madhab. It's takhrij, it's not ijtihad. Broadly. In changing times, sometimes need arises for taking positions on certain things, but that's really an ijtihad takhriji. It's a derivative ijtihad. Because on most possible human actions, they've already been addressed in their fundamentals. So the role of dalil here is for us to have conviction, clarity, and so we're driven to act. Right? We appreciate the wisdom underlying the rulings. Right? تَسُرُّ بِهِ قلوب المؤمنين, that brings happiness to the hearts of believers, because the believers rejoice in the good. They rejoice in the bounty of Allah and His mercy. And this is a manifestation of divine bounty and a means to divine mercy. وَتَلَذُّ بِهِ الْأَعْيُنُ وَالْأَسْمَاعُ, and eyes and ears will find ladha, will find sweetness in it. Why? Because it's a means to good. And the believers, يَفْرَحُونَ, they rejoice in the means of good. Right? جمعت فيه ما احتوى عليه شرحي للمقدمة. Right? I gathered in it what is contained in my commentary to my introductory work. The sharh being referred to here is إمداد الفتاح, and the مقدمة is نور الإيضاح. بالتماس أفاضل أعيان للخير. Right? By the request of some notable of high standing, right? And the ulama are not clear. There's been some speculation of who it was. Right? Imam Tahtawi says that it might be his students. It may well have been his students. Because Nur al-Ilah became widespread. They wrote a large commentary, they wanted something easier to study. They said a good chance that it's student, but because this is a diligent student, etc., out of his humility and out of offering respect, he referred to them by the notables and so on, also tafa'ulan bil khair. Or it might be some of his peers. Right? But he did not mention the name explicitly, and we don't appear to have clear evidence of who it was. Right? Muqaddimatan, as a introductory work, taqriban lil-tullab, to make things easy, make things close for a seeker. And one of the aspects of it being a muqaddimah, Maraqi al-Falah, is a muqaddimah to the deeper study of the madhab. So Nur al-Idah, after you've studied the fiqh of worship, gathers what you need to know about the fiqh of worship. Okay? Once you understand the fiqh of worship in its core, it fills in the details for you. That's Nur al-Ilah. The Maraqi, now, once you know the fiqh of worship well, now you need to start moving on to the full study of all the chapters of the madhab. But as a facilitative way, taqriban lil-tullab, to make it closer to students, what does he do? In Maraqi, he gives them a lot of the tools that they know, that they need to be able to successfully navigate the other chapters of fiqh. To understand how legal reasoning works. How do the ulama choose between different opinions? A lot of the legal method of the Hanafi school, things like istihsan, legal preference. Right? Where does darura, need, umum al-balwa, general hardship, and these things apply? Many of the considerations in choosing opinions, he points to them subtly. So that by a proper, thorough study of Maraqi al-Falah, in a comfortable space, in the space of rulings that you have familiarity with, because someone before studying Nur al-Ilah itself should have studied 2 texts on the fiqh of worship. Before studying Maraqi al-Falah, you should have studied Nur al-Ilah. Now if someone's really diligent and they're willing to put in the work, ahlan wa sahlan, study the Maraqi, but you got to put in the work, like you're preparing yourself to first understand Nur al-Ilah, and then just like you're studying 2 texts at once. Understand the matan, understand the sharh, to do justice to it. This is how the commentary is a muqaddimah to the commentaries of the school, to appreciate what's going on in Quduri and in the works post-Quduri. تسهيلا لما به الفوز في المآب, and facilitating that which is the means for success in the hereafter. Because also reminding that yes, it's very useful for students in their journey of fiqh, but don't forget that your journey of fiqh is just part of a broader journey into the hereafter. Right? Knowledge is found on the path to Allah, and it's signposts on the path to Allah, but it's not the goal. it's a means. وَسَمَّيْتُهُ مَرَاقِي الْفَلَاحِ. I have named it the means of ascent to eternal success, بِإِمْدَادِ الْفَتَّاحِ, by the assistance of the grantor of openings. شرح نور الإيضاح, in commentary on the light of clarity. و شرح نور الإيضاح ونجاة الأرواح, and the salvation of souls. والله الكريم أسأل, and it is Allah the Noble that I ask. And this تقديم المفعول, mentioning the object of the sentence before the verb, is للحصر والاختصاص. If you say أسأل الله, you could say والدي, I ask Allah and my father. But you say Allah أسأل, it is Allah I ask, meaning أي لا أسأل سواه, I ask no one else. It's like when if we say نعبدك, we worship you, you could put and after it. Not that it's allowed in expression, but you say إياك نعبد, it is you we worship. Also highlight Allah is greater than you're asking of Him. وَبِحَبِيبِهِ الْمُصْطَفَى عَلَيْهِ الصَّلَاةُ وَالسَّلَامُ إِلَيْهِ أَتَوَسَّلُ, and by His beloved messenger, the chosen one, to Him, to Allah, I seek an intercession, tawassul. Because tawassul is one of the sunnahs of dua, as we see in Kitab al-Adhkar of Imam al-Nawawi. If you look in Kitab al-Hajjah, there are two sunnah du'as of Hajjah. One is what's famous as Salat al-Hajjah, and the other is the hadith of the blind man, where the Prophet ﷺ taught the blind man to make tawassul. Right? And the ulama who wrote on the adab of dua, including Imam Nawawi and Ibn al-Jazari in al-Hisn al-Hasin, al-Zarkashi in al-Azhiya في الأزهية في أحكام الأدعية, Imam Burhan al-Din al-Zarkashi. Likewise, Shaykh al-Islam Zakaria al-Ansari, his commentary upon it, all deemed tawassul as being one of the supplementary adab. It's not from the core adab, but from the supplementary adab of dua, because it's established in the sunnah. It's a secondary matter, but it's established. And the ruling of tawassul in all four schools of Sunni Islam is that tawassul is permissible and soundly practiced, it is praiseworthy. This is clearly established. Just the fact that Imam Shambulani did it indicates that ruling, but the authorities of the Hanafi school affirm this. And this is not just a late Hanafi school thing. Just look in the Ikhtiyar, for example, in the chapter on Hajj, and many, many other works. It's well documented. Likewise, in each of the other three schools as well. So if someone has an objection to tawassul, that's up to them. But they should be aware, and we should be fair, that the position that they're choosing goes against all four schools of Sunni Islam. They're free not to practice it, but Imam Al-Izz ibn Abd al-Salam relates ijma', scholarly consensus, that أنه لا يحل الإنكار في مسائل الخلاف. It is not permissible in our religion, by scholarly consensus, to condemn any position where there is established difference of opinion. And there's consensus on the permissibility of following any one of the four schools of Sunni Islam in its relied upon position. So let alone when something is permitted in all four schools. So you have your own choice, ahlan wa sahlan, take it. No one's asking you to practice it, but it is haram to condemn something that is where even there is an established difference of opinion about, let alone something that is not the position across the jumhur, across the overwhelming majority of Islamic scholarship. Right? So beware of the confusion merchants of our times. So he says, and by his chosen prophet, I make tawassul and yanfa' bihi jami' al-ummah, that he benefit through it the entire ummah. Because you are rewarded for your intention, not for the result. So some of the great du'at of Islam intended that by the da'wah نويت أن أدعو الناس كلهم إلى الله وإلى الخير كله. That I intend to call all people without exception to Allah and to all good. Now of course he's only going to be able to reach some people with some of the good. Because capacity and time and opportunity doesn't, but you're rewarded according to your intention. And this is from his sunnah. This is from what the Prophet ﷺ used to think deeply about in his silence, was how to convey the greatest, widest, and most lasting benefit to his ummah in a manner that would encompass for them the good of this life and the next in the most beneficial of ways, as explained by Sayyidina Ali ibn Abi Talib. So, and yanfa, right? Because also khairun nas anfa'hum lin nas, wa khairun nas aqrabuhum ila Allah. Right? The best of people are those of greatest benefit to other people. And the best of people are those who are closest to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So naf'un nas is miftah min mafatih al-qurb. Benefiting people is a key from the keys of closeness to Allah. Bishart al-ikhlas. But to do it not for the people, and not for the benefit, and not for the prominence, but لله ta'ala. وَلْيَتَقَبَّلَهُ بِفَضْلِهِ, and that Allah accept it with His generosity. And qabul is of the most noble things to ask for. Why? Because al-kareem in qabil yaqbalu bikaramihi. If the most generous accepts, he accepts with his generosity. وَالْكَرِيمُ لَا تَتَخَطَّاهُ الْآمَالِ, and the most generous, even the highest of hopes, cannot go past it. So some of the ulama ask that, why would you just ask for acceptance? Shouldn't you just ask for the highest of the good? No, because qabul, بِمَا هُوَ أَهْلُهُ, by what befits him. That's why very often the Quran says, Allah al-Kareem, Allah the most generous, I ask to accept. Don't accept me according to my worth, don't accept me according to this action or its benefit or so on. Accept it بِمَا أَنْتَ أَهْلُهُ, by what befits you. And يَتَقَبَّلَهُ بِفَضْلِهِ وَيَحْفَظَهُ مِنْ شَرِّ مَنْ لَيْسَ مِنْ أَهْلِهِ, and He protected from the harm of those who are not of its people. Why? Because the reality of hasad is an experienced reality. People are envious. Some people are envious. One's peers can be envious. Why? Because they wish they had what you have. But that's at least a sin with some nobility in it. The person wished they had it. So it's vile, but you can see why they're doing that. But just as prevalent is the hasad of someone who has no aspiration. Say, okay, Fadl, you come and teach. They won't want to do it. Then you come and take the position. Right? So someone doesn't want Zayn to be the president of the board of the masjid. Do you want to be the president? No, I just don't want him to. Why is he the president? Right? Envy. Just, how come? He won't step up. Right? So hasad is a destructive reality. And it applies in knowledge because it's the most noble of matters. Anything that is sought after, people will vie with others for it. Number one. So that's one type of envy. The other type of envy is that something that is sought after and is worthy, there's people who feel unfulfilled, who harbor all kinds of ill will towards someone who has that. This is why discretion is a sunnah with any type of blessing. إِذْ هُوَ مِنْ أَجَلِّ النِّعْمَةِ, because this matter, the matter of beneficial knowledge, its gathering, preservation and transmission, is of the most exalted of blessings. وَأَعْظَمِ الْمِنَّةِ, and of the most tremendous of gifts. وَاللَّهَ أَسْأَلْ أَنْ يَنْفَعَ بِهِ عِبَادًا, and it is Allah I ask that He benefit through it His servants. وَيُدِيمَ بِهِ الْإِفَادَةِ, and that He make continued by it the benefiting. Ifada, from
from the giving of benefit. أفاد يفيد, to be giving of benefit. إنه على ما يشاء قدير. He is completely able of all that he wills. وبالإجابة جدير, and he is truly responsive. Ameen. Okay? Now, with respect to tawassul, just one point. Of the best works written on tawassul is Imam Muhammad Zahid al-Kawthari's work, محو التقول في مسألة التوسل. Wiping out all chatter, taqawul, on the matter of tawassul. It's a brief treatise, you can find it in his maqalat. It's brilliant. And much else has been written on it, especially in this age of causing confusion. So that is the opening. Next week we're going to begin with Kitab al-Tahara, but someone have the... So the Nur al-Idah has its own introduction, which has a few points of benefit. The most significant was this idea that the method itself gathered what is spread out in the larger works. And that is the most important point of benefit. So when we touched upon that, but you would do well to read. So after the opening dua, etc., right? He said that he wrote it because some people close to him asked بلطفه الخف أعمل مقدمة في العبادات, that I gathered a introductory work in العبادات تقرب على المبتدئ, that brings close to the beginner ما تشتت من المسائل في المطولات, or that which is disparate of issues in the larger works. Now, a few things to keep in mind. He says that this is a muqaddimah. A muqaddimah does not mean it's a short work. Right? A muqaddimah is ما يتقدم على المقصود. So the study of fiqh, right? What's sought. So this is a stepping stone to the full study of fiqh. In that sense, it's a muqaddimah. Right? It introduces you. It's also muqaddimah because it's a matan. It introduces you to the subject. Doesn't preclude details, and the sharh gives all the details. Right? So muqaddimah, insofar you understand the method, and then you get the details in the sharh. But also it's a muqaddimah to the full study of fiqh. Right? Al-Mubtadi', now the beginner, there's levels of beginner. There's the complete beginner who is مَنْ لَمْ يَتَعَلَّمْ شَيْئًا. Al-Mubtadi' al-Tam. Right? Someone who's not studied at all. Then you have المبتدئ من ابتدأ في طلبه للعلم. Okay? Someone who actually started. So you can put, some mention 3, some mention 4. Someone just begun studying. This is not for the beginner, this is not for the one who's never studied. Number 2, it's not for the one who's just begun. Then you have, and the complete beginner, they say, المبتدئ في أوائل طلبه لا يحسن تصور المسائل. He doesn't know what the issues are yet. Then you have المبتدئ في وسطه طلبه الابتدائي, like who is now in midst of his establishing his foundation. Okay? And that مبتدئ is the one who studied the subject بحيث يحسن تصور مسائله لكن لا يحسن أن يعبر عنها بلغة الفن. So you understand, he can conceive of the issues, but he can't necessarily express himself according to the terminology of the subject. Okay? وتخفى عليه مسائل كثيرة, and many details that he doesn't know. Right? And he does not really have a grasp on the basic reasoning. Then you have al-Mubtadi' al-muhassil, the beginner who has attained some knowledge, who understands the issues, can explain the issues, knows a lot of the key details. Right? So he's getting ready now. The mubtadi al-muhassil is getting ready to go to the intermediate phase. He's consolidating his foundations. Of these four types of mubtadi, the unlearned, the beginning learner, the beginner who's now got some background, and the beginner who's got a solid background, it is al-mubtadi al-muhassil that is meant as the subject of Nur al-Idah, ideally. And someone a little below that, if they work hard, could benefit as well. Large commentaries on the madhab, indicating, of course, the merit of what Imam Shurun Gulali did. He gathered, right, a lot that is disparate. فَاسْتَعَنْتُ بِاللَّهِ تَعَالَى وَأَجَبْتُ. So I placed my trust in Allah and I answered him. And this is one of the interesting sunnahs of Islam. Some of the works that benefit the most is works that either a student asked their teacher that could you do something on this, and the teacher responded, because that idea of expression of need is one of the places where divine assistance manifests itself. Or if they're asked by their teacher and they listen, because imtithal amr. So we'll see Imam Laqani's teacher asked him to write a matan in Aqidah. He wrote it in one night, 144 lines. And then and very quickly, some say the same night, 500 copies were written of it. It was not by one person necessarily. It was someone wrote it, and then they would have a whole, they dictate it, and people make imla of it. So, so Allahu A'lam about that, but there's great barakah in that. Right? And he says, also in the introduction, وَلَا أَذْكُرْ إِلَّا مَا جَزَمَ بِصِحَّتِهِ أَهْلُ التَّرْجِيحِ. And I only mention, I do not mention other than that which the ulama of tarjih, who chose between the opinions in the madhab, affirmed unequivocally is sound. See, so this is a benefit that's not there. Right? That he's not just judging himself what's sahih, based on what the Ahl al-Tarjih said is sound, وَإِن لَمْ يَكُنِ الْأَصَحِ, even if it's not the asah, as mentioned in Imdad al-Fattah. He said, من غير إطناب, without going on and on, غفر الله لنا, وسميته نور الإيضاح, and I called it this. And so there's a few points of benefit in Nur al-Idah that you would find of benefit with Allah. So we try to give a sense of the madhab before beginning. Now, the opening sections of Tahara, we're going to go fast, and because there are fundamental principles, but the types of water, and especially things water related, what is al-ma' al-mutlaq? Open the tap. And that is the khulasa of what is al-ma' al-mutlaq. Now, we may not be able to open our taps as freely as we do now because of, the ظهور الفساد في البر والبحر, because of what we've done to the planet we're the custodians of. But it is, so these rulings don't go out of fashion. Right? We have a duty to preserve this guidance because, and also sometimes we have arrogance that, well, everybody has access to water. No. And we should, when we have those of us who are blessed to have plentiful water, to realize that much of the world does not have this plentiful water. It's our thing to assume that. Right? And these are rulings that are, there's also janib of ta'zeem when it comes to the rulings of the Sharia. Why? The rulings of the Sharia are the hukum of Allah and His Messenger, or that which is understood from the hukum of Allah and His Messenger. So sometimes they may not apply to us, may not relate to us directly right now. One is we approach it with ta'zeem, with veneration. Number two, sometimes when we begin our study, we may not imagine that this thing may apply. So when we look at the rulings on hayl and stuff, what if there's a a child is born in pieces. Someone say, why would a child be born in pieces? Well, what happens when an abortion takes place? Because of whether legitimate reasons or illegitimate reasons. Right? So that's like, when does a child come in pieces? Why did they mention it? Because there are either the issue applies or there are derivative applications. So this is just illustrative of a principle for which there is derivative application. So we should have humility with the rules. And this attitude, they say, لا ينال العلم متكبر ولا مستحيل. Knowledge is not attained by one who's arrogant nor shy. The arrogant, what is this? Like kind of to arrogate themselves above the knowledge. And when something is not clear, why is this mentioned? So we just ask. We just ask. And there's a bunch of stuff in Tahara. Some of it will go quickly on. Right? So the owner, especially on the things of water, if you have questions about it, you have to ask that. Because we're going to accelerate a little bit through it and focus on the more practicable things. But there's principles that are illustrated. But beware, because many things do have a lot of applications, right? If someone becomes a student, like for example, say they talk about these big bodies of water, how they become najis. Industrial production. What happens if you get, you decide to make fruit juices, and the mouse love the fruit juice, and 2 mice are dead in your vat of fruit juice. What happens? You decide to start a farm, or you didn't decide to start a farm, but a farmer asked you. When we milk our cows, because just think about where the milk comes from and where the excrement comes from. What might happen? While you're milking, some excrement falls into it. It happens. Now, you may never become a farmer. You don't intend to leave Mississauga. But what if a farmer asks you, you end up saying whatever you say. So don't, say, who cares about the tahara of fish excrement? What if someone's fish, I have a friend who was cleaning out his fish tank, and decided to just be lazy and just pour it, and he emptied out the fish tank all over his wall-to-wall carpet. So what's the ruling of that? There's a small house, that's the only place a group of people could pray in this house. So it may seem like who cares about fish excrement? There's practical implications. People ask, وَهَلْ يَسْتَوِي الَّذِينَ يَعْلَمُونَ وَالَّذِينَ لَا يَعْلَمُونَ? Right? Could people pray Salatul Jama'ah there or not? Significant. Do they have to clean the whole thing out? Spend hundreds of dollars? No. And the ruling there is that there's a general principle, all excrement is filthy, but then there's exceptions. Amongst the exceptions is that fish excrement is not najis. It's either pure or excused. But either way, something affected by fish excrement does not need to be purified. So, so many things may seem strange, and when you have questions about things like that, ask and seek clarification. وصلى الله على سيدنا ونبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم والحمد لله.